Yeah.
build it out your system before you settle down. Like, these men never settled down. That's just it. They would get married and they would still keep doing it.
Yes.
And their wives had no choice. They just had to deal with it. I guess they traveled to Gibraltar, Malta, Greece, Ioannina. That was not, I have no idea how to pronounce that. Albania. In 1810, they sailed to Constantinople. Not Istanbul, not Constantinople.
All you can think of, right?
If you have a date in Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul, you know. And they went to, like, they visited where, like, Troy and Hellespont, and they swam. And I mean, this time in his life is when he fell in love with Greece, the country Greece. He found the Greeks to be very tolerant people. They were free and open. They weren't as morally sequestered as the English. Yeah, so they were more open about how they thought and how they felt. And I think they were actually more open about same-sex relationships, too.
Right.
And that has a lot to do, if you look at, like, ancient Greece. They were very much open about that as well. But in 1811, his mother was ill, so he was returning to England, but she actually passed away before he got home. After he got home, he actually found out that his boyhood love, John Edelson, had died of consumption.
Oh.
Only 21. So yeah, 21 would probably. So he was. Byron was 23 at this point because he was 2 years older. In 1812, he would have been considered, at this point, a Whig, which would be like the liberal part of the government.
Side of it, yeah.
They would consider him a radical liberal. And he spoke in the House of Lords against the Tories, and they were the conservative group. And he also, this year, he had Childe Harold's Pilgrimage was being published, and it was published in multiple, like, I don't want to say drafts, but parts were published. Like, he'd publish part 1, and then part 2 would be published, and then part 3, like, years apart. So people would have to, like, get this little volume, and there was multiple parts to it. And that's kind of like. And this was basically a story about his adventures, basically, in Europe. This is what brought fame to Byron, and it was like overnight fame. Like, he woke up famous. Like, all of a sudden, like, his book is published, and now everybody knows this. Everybody's talking about him. They hound him. They see him in the street. You know, this is where he finds his pomposity. His arrogance and his pomposity. I mean, I'm pretty sure he was probably pretty arrogant before this.
Right.
But now we're talking.
Now his head's gotten fuller and fuller.
Yeah, he's really full of himself at this point. He had a lot of affairs, and I'm not going to mention all of them, because I'm sure not even all of them are mentioned, because he probably had affairs with people that didn't have, like, that weren't important, you know.
Right.
At this point, he had started an affair with Lady Caroline Lamb, and everybody was afraid that they were going to go and elope, but his friends convinced him not to. And then he started an affair with Lady Oxford. I mean, these are women of his class he's having affairs with, probably married, some of them. It's rumored that in the summer of 1813, he started a love affair with his half-sister, Augusta.
Yeah.
And she was actually married to a colonel or something, but she was married, and he was having it was rumored that he was having an affair with his sister.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't care if she's your half-sister or not. She's your sister. No. Hands off.
No. You have biologically have the same stuff going on there. Half or not. Yuck.
And then he was also having an affair with a Lady Frances Webster. In 1814, he married Anna Isabella Milburgh. He referred to her as Annabella. And their daughter, Augusta Ada, was born in December of 1815. So they got married, and he had a daughter by the end of the next year. And then in January, this is right after she had this baby, she leaves him. And she stated it was, like, due to his, like, he had unnatural acts. She accused him of forcing her to perform unnatural acts.
He had some kinks that she wasn't into.
But it was due to his incestuous affair and his being a bisexual. And that's he was probably having an affair with his sister, and his wife knew, and he was having affairs with men, and his wife knew.
And she was like, no.
I am done with this business. Goodbye.
Right.
You know, your husband having an affair with anybody would be bad. But if it's his sister, no. Goodbye.
No.
Nope, I'm gone.
And really, like, if you're in a polyamorous relationship, there's nothing wrong with it, but everyone has to be consensual upon the beginning of the relationship, that this is, or at some point talking about it, and this is what we're going to do. It's not okay to say I'm polyamorous and then not tell the person you're with that you are.
Especially if you marry a young woman who has been sheltered her whole life and has grown up a certain way. This is like the most taboo thing probably she's ever heard in her life. And she's like, what did I get myself into? I think I'm marrying this wonderful love man who's going to write me poetry.
Right. No. He's so romantic.
Right. And that's not what she got. No. She's like, she'd had enough. Eventually they were legally separated, and he left England in a swirl of rumors, and he left because he couldn't deal with the pressure, because especially the people of his class in England were kind of like, they didn't like what he was doing. They didn't like that he was having an affair with his sister, that he was having affairs with men. That was like taboo. You're like, nope, you gotta, like, we don't want you around.
Right.
So he left. He kind of fled on the heels of, with the rumors on his heels. Like, he's leaving, and
he's like, I'm out of here.
Rumors. He's like, gone. I mean, he never returned to England alive. Like, he left in April of 1816 to Europe, and then he stayed in Europe until he died. This is when he ended up in Switzerland and had that famous night with Mary Shelley and friends. Yes. And he continued his affair with Mary's sister Claremont. Yep. And it was rumored that he started that affair when she was 16. That's when he met her. And she was totally enamored with him. Like, she was so in love with him, obsessed with him. But that's how a lot of people felt about him. Like, especially...
I probably would have been too.
People. Oh, I'm sure. You kind of are now. And it's like 100 years, 150, 200 years.
And I know he's awful.
It's 200 years after the fact. Yeah.
Never met him.
Claire eventually, like, he leaves her behind because he's not in for a permanent relationship really with anybody. He just wants to have fun. He wants to have sex. He's having fun. She eventually got pregnant and gave birth to a daughter named Allegra in England in 1817. So by October, Byron and Hobhouse, his friend from college, they're still climbing their way across Europe, so to speak. They left for Italy, and by May they were in Rome, and they were having he was having multiple affairs the whole way there. Like, there's lists of women he was with, like, known. Like,
right.
It was known that he was with. There was probably a ton of women that he was with that nobody knew about, too. Probably men as well. And by autumn of 1818, he had sold Newstead Abbey to cover his debts, and it gave himself some more income. So he's like, to supply himself with the money he needed to continue his lifestyle, he's like, I don't plan on ever going back to England. I'll just sell my family home and get the money and not worry about it.
Right. So I can just live my life the way I want.
And he started writing Don Juan, and that was published in 1819. And by 1818, it was said by Shelley, and I don't know if it was Mary Shelley or Percy Shelley, because I know Percy Shelley and him were still friends, and others that had visited him, that he had gained weight and was looking unkempt. He had long hair, he hadn't cut his hair, and this was because of his lifestyle of indulgence. He'd kind of let himself go. Like, he was fat, he had long hair, he was known to be a snappy dresser. Like, he dressed at the height of fashion. He spent a lot of money on tailors. He looked good, and that was part of his allure with women.
Right.
We'll find out the other part that was an allure to women.
I can imagine what that is.
You can, I'm sure. Especially because of what I talked about the last time I did one of
Margaret,
these.
You have a little session.
And it wasn't on purpose. I just started doing research, and then when I realized where it was going, I'm like, oh man, another one? And I had invested enough time in it that I'm like, I'm just going to continue with it. It's fine. Anyway. This all was to change when he met a 19-year-old countess by the name of Teresa Gamba Guiccioli. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry, any Italians listening to this, that I butchered that, but her name was beautiful, and I'm sure she was a beautiful woman. And he was 30 at this point, and enamored with this 19-year-old. And she was married to a man 3 times her age. So him being 30 was probably a catch, because she's with a man who's
old.
80?
I didn't even know people lived that long.
60 or 80. I mean, he was old. Her husband was an old man. He was like in his 60s or later. He followed her around Italy, right? And by 1820, he had the title of her Cavalier Servant, which is a gentleman in waiting. So, like, he was her gentleman in waiting, and we know what he was waiting for.
Yeah.
He had befriended her family. Her father and her brother loved him. But I'm sure he was a very charming individual because he was a poet and a writer. I'm sure he knew his way around words. But her father, his name was Count Ruggiero, initiated him into the secret society of the Carbonari. Doesn't that sound like a secret pasta society? Like, I want to join that. Like the Carbonari. I feel like it sounds like a delicious pasta dish.
Yeah.
Like, I want to be in that society. Tie me up for some yummy Carbonari.
So long.
Get me in that society. Well, the purpose of this society was to free Italy from Austrian rule, because at this point, Italy is being ruled by Austria. And in November of 1821, he was in Pisa. Love that leaning tower there, right? After leaving, Claire had sent their daughter Allegra to live with him. And he didn't want to be bothered with her, so he sent her to a convent, which I'm sure her mother didn't know about, and she died the following April. So in November, he leaves his daughter behind in this convent, and then she died in April. So a nice dad we've got going on here. It's like, no, she cramped his style. He couldn't have that.
Yeah, and he did not want Claire to have her. And she was like, I can't, like, she didn't have the money. She thought she would get a better life with her father, and that's why she sent him there.
I know. And it's just sad that she ended up dying, and I'm sure that Claire had horrible guilt afterwards.
Oh, I'm sure.
How could she still be in love with Byron? I would have hated him. As soon as I got pregnant and he left, I would have hated him. I've been like, you're dead. I'm going to cut your junk off, buddy. You're done. You're done. I wouldn't really do that, but I can say it because it sounds fun.
You'll Lorena Bobbitt.
Yeah. The summer of 1822, Byron had rented a villa in Livorno with Percy Shelley, and they were writing together, like a periodical. And in July, Shelley had drowned at this point. He drowned and died. And they still, like, the periodical was still printed, but eventually Byron lost interest in that. It was not giving him what he needed. And that September, he moved back to Genoa, where Teresa's family had found asylum, because her family was part of the uprising in Italy. And then they were kind of banished, and they had moved to Genoa, where they could live and not worry about getting murdered by the Ottomans. And in April of 1823, it was like a year later, he was acting as the agent of the London Committee that was formed to aid the Greeks in their fight for independence from Turkey. So we're still in, like, Italy and Greece, and they're trying to get out from under the clutches of the Ottomans, and London gives him this title of agent to work on their behalf to help the Greeks fight for their independence, basically. Okay. Which is so funny because England just lost when America fought for their independence, and they lost. And I guess maybe they're like, you know what? We need to be on the other side for once. And so he left in July for Cephalonia. He gave 4,000 pounds of his own money to the Greek sea fleet. And they sailed in December for Missolonghi to join the forces in western Greece. They gave him command of a brigade of soldiers who were like the elite soldiers of Greece. Like, he had command of them. Like, that's he's crazy. Not a soldier. It's just insane.
He's a poet.
He's famous. That's like saying, oh, Kiefer Sutherland, you did so good in 24. We're going to head you up a SWAT team. Here you go. Like, no, that doesn't work. Yeah. It doesn't work like that, right?
Exactly.
But anyway, it didn't need to work because by that February of 1824, he had become very ill. And it had been very weak. Like, that April, he developed a fever, and he died on April 19th. He had written, and people had talked of, he would have intermittent fevers that would rack his body. He'd have fevers and chills, and then they would go away, and then a year later they would come back, and it would be like he'd have these fevers and chills with no known origin, and he would suffer, and then